Welcome everybody to this new study that I'm really excited about, Making Sense of Revelation. Revelation is one of my favourite books in the New Testament, and so I'm really excited to be getting into it. If you haven't already seen, do make sure you check out the handout that's in the description available to download. I've just made a helpful page so that you can have something to follow along with, and you can add your own notes to it if you'd like. Now, unfortunately, Revelation is widely seen as a closed book by many Christians because it's too confusing and we don't want to presume that we can really know what it means. And it doesn't help that some of the most confident commentators of it have been absolute wackos. And so G.K. Chesterton once said, "Though John saw many strange monsters in his vision, he saw no creature so wild as one of his own commentators." So we're going to be brave enough to join that list of wild commentators. But first, I just want to say what this study is not intended to be and what it is intended to be, just so we get an idea of what we're getting into. So what it's not intended to be, it's not going to be an attack on other views or constantly taking down what other people have said. I don't want to do that. It's not going to be a comprehensive verse by verse, chapter by chapter study. We're not going to look at every part of Revelation. And it's not a sermon or a devotional series. So I'm not going to be finishing every part with application. There will be application at the end of the study, but this is a study. What it is intended to be, well, this is going to be an introduction to an interpretation of Revelation that I believe to be the correct one. I'm going to make a positive case for it. So, as I said earlier, I'm not going to be taking down other views. I'm just going to be showing why I think what I think is right. And this is a study to give a framework for navigating this confusing book. I'm not going to tell you what everything means. I want to give you a framework so that you can understand it for yourself. Also, I just want to really recommend this book. It's called When the Man Comes Around by Douglas Wilson. It's a commentary on Revelation that was released last year. This is the first time I've ever just sat down and read a commentary as a book. This book really was so accessible, so helpful, and as I say, you could just sit down and read it. So I really want to recommend that, When the Man Comes Around by Douglas Wilson. So in this part one, we're going to look at what I call the 3 Ds of Revelation: the difficulties, the distinctives, and the date. And the last point, the date, that's going to take the priority because it has a huge deal on when it comes to interpreting the book. Today we're not actually going to talk much about the meaning of the book, but we're just going to focus on these 3 Ds. So firstly, some basic information that pretty much everyone is in agreement with when we come to Revelation. Firstly, it's written by John the Apostle, the same author as the Gospel of John. It was written on Patmos, an island just off the coast of modern-day Turkey, which the Roman Empire would exile people to, and that it was written to 7 historical churches in Asia Minor, so Ephesus, Smyrna, Pergamum, Thyatira, Sardis, Philadelphia, and Laodicea. So some of the difficulties in the book, now that we've seen what everyone agrees with, the difficulties, well, it's a very confusing book. If you've ever read it, you'll see that for yourself. It's got a lot of things in it which are hard to understand, and it could be used different ways. And because of this, it's been used by all kinds of false teachers and cults they've kind of cashed in on the confusion or the ambiguous nature to say this is what it means and put forward their own interpretation for their own benefit. For the same reason, it was whilst it was a very popular book in the early church, so lots of people in the early church read it and quoted it, it had a hard time being accepted as part of the New Testament canon just because it was so confusing and so many different views were around on it. So it had a hard time being accepted as canonical. And because of that, even able scholars have been wary of putting their flag in the ground on it, saying what it means. So John Calvin, for instance, wrote a commentary on every book of the New Testament except for Revelation. He stayed clear of that. But because it's so full of symbolism. And because of this, it's hard to tell what's symbolic. And obviously, symbolic doesn't mean it has no meaning. Symbols have a meaning. But it's hard to tell what's symbolic and what those symbols mean and what's literal. But despite all this, despite all these difficulties, it's called revelation. It is intended to reveal, not conceal. So there is truth in there for us. So some of the distinctives of the book. Well, the most primary distinctive of the book is that it's the only apocalyptic book in the New Testament. So the genre of apocalypse is a very specific genre. The word apocalypse comes from the Greek word apokalypsis, which means to unveil or reveal. It's why it's called the Revelation, because in the Greek text, in chapter 1, verse 1, it says the apocalypsis of Jesus Christ, the revelation of Jesus Christ. It's a very familiar genre in the Old Testament. So Isaiah, Ezekiel, Jeremiah, Joel, Zechariah, these are all full of apocalypse, of the genre. And it's very distinct. It's a very unique genre. It's distinct from historical narrative, for instance. You can't read apocalypse in the same way that you'd read historical narrative. So books like Exodus or the Gospels, for instance, are historical narrative. They're saying what happened, where it happened, who did it, all those kind of things. Whereas apocalypse uses a lot of symbols, and it is a very different genre, so you can't read them in the same way. And Revelation is the only apocalyptic book we have in the New Testament. But as we'll see later on in the study, it's not the only place in the New Testament with this genre, with apocalypse, but it is the only book which is entirely apocalypse. Another distinctive is its use of the Old Testament. So one of the things that we notice when you get to Revelation is it's absolutely saturated with the Old Testament. I think of all the books in the New Testament, it has the most Old Testament references. And we'll get into some of these specifically as we go through, but it uses passages like Psalm 2, for instance, and the book of Zechariah heavily. So if you were to read Revelation and then go and read Zechariah, or vice versa, you'd notice a lot of similarities. A third distinctive of Revelation is its use of symbolic numbers and dates and locations and characters. So that this kind of follows with the apocalyptic genre, but Revelation contains lots and lots of symbols. So if you've read it before, you would have seen it talk about characters like lambs and lions and beasts and harlots and dragons and women crowned with stars. And there's dates like 1,290 days and 3.5 years and 42 months and 1,000 years and a little season. It talks about numbers like 12,000 times 12 making 144,000 and the famous 666, and you better believe we're going to be talking about that one. And locations, it talks about the holy city, which is symbolically called Sodom and Gomorrah. It talks about Babylon. It talks about New Jerusalem. And so we have a whole lot of elements of the story which are given in symbols for us to work out. And just on this, I'll give you a sneak preview about what the book is about using these symbols. The lamb wins. And we'll get into what I mean by that as we get further into the study. So that's the difficulties and the distinctives. Now, we're getting to what I really want to focus on this part, which is the date. And as I say, the date is really significant for how we interpret this book. So there are two ways that scholars use to work out the dating of any ancient document, not just biblical books, any ancient document. And they are called self-witness or internal evidence, which is about what the book itself says. So, for instance, if there is a book that I find, an autobiography of someone living in New York, and they say, and so I went up the Twin Towers and I enjoyed my time there, and so on and so forth, I can safely assume that this was written prior to 9/11, because after 9/11 there were no two towers to go and explore. So that would be self-witness. We know that it was written before that point. The other way that we work out the date of books is what's called tradition or external evidence. And this is about what other people have said about the book. So if I use a similar example, if I find a book and I don't know where it's written, so I Google some reviews and find that every single review comes after 2011, I can safely assume that the book came into being in 2011 or 2010. It gives me a marker to work out when it came from. So that's tradition. And the two views which are put forward for Revelation are pre-70 AD, so before the temple in Jerusalem fell, and that's going to be a really significant point. So the temple in Jerusalem, or Jerusalem itself, was destroyed by the Roman army in 70 AD. It started in 67 AD and it ended in 70 AD when the temple was destroyed. So one view of Revelation is that it was written before this happened, and the other view was that it was written in 95 or 96 AD. So the early date would be under Emperor Nero, and the late date would be under Emperor Domitian. And scholars go back and forth on these two views. So in the 19th and the 20th century, the early date was the most commonly held view. It was the dominant one. Nowadays, the late date is the most common. So if you pick up any commentary on Revelation today, I can almost guarantee you they will hold to the late date. But there is currently in academia, in the scholarly world, a reversal going on, with lots of scholars going back to the early date in light of new evidence and stuff that's come forward recently. So the early date is really being taken up again, which I affirm, and I think that's a really good thing. I'm going to show you why I think the early date is the correct one. So first, let's look at some tradition. Now, this is by no means an exhaustive list. This is just some of the major players that I want to use up. I don't want to spend all our time looking at church history. I'd rather look at what the book itself says. But the first source, this is the most commonly used source for the late date. So if you pick up any commentary who affirm the late date, I guarantee you this will be the first reference they give. So this comes from a man called Irenaeus, and Irenaeus wrote in 180 AD in a book called Against Heresies, which, as the name would suggest, was where he wrote against heresies. So this quote that's relevant to the date of Revelation is this: "We will not, however, incur the risk of pronouncing positively the name of Antichrist. For if it were necessary that his name should be distinctly revealed in this present time, it would have been announced by him who beheld the apocalyptic vision. For that was seen no very long time since, but almost in our day, towards the end of Domitian's reign." So you're hearing what he says there. He's talking about the identity of the Antichrist, and he says, we don't know. If it was necessary for us to know, we would have been told. After all, it was seen not a very long time ago, almost in our day, towards the end of Domitian's reign. So people would say, Irenaeus is saying that John saw the vision, John saw the revelation at the end of Domitian's reign, which was about 95, 96 AD. But there are a few issues with this. The first being that this is written in Greek, and Greek functions differently to English. It's what's called an inflected language. I'm not going to go into the detail of what an inflected language means, but very basically it means that there is no that or it or he in this sentence. It just has the verb. So it just says, for was seen. So the subject of the verb is implied. You know which one it refers to in context. So it means that Irenaeus could be saying, for he was seen no very long time since, i.e. John, but almost in our day towards the end of Domitian's reign. So he could be saying, John was seen not a very long time ago, he was last seen at the end of Domitian's reign. Or he's saying, the apocalyptic vision, Revelation, was seen towards the end of Domitian's reign. So that's one issue with it. I believe that he is referring to John, not Revelation, and that leads us on to the second point, the second issue, in that in his book Against Heresies, if you read through Against Heresies, Irenaeus' main point against the heretics, his main emphasis, is that the apostles and their teaching has been passed down through people who saw them face to face and heard them talk firsthand. And so he starts this section of the quote I just read by saying, he's talking about the number 666, and he says, this number, 666, is found in all the most ancient and approved copies, and those men who saw John face to face bear testimony to it. So his main point is that we saw the apostles and we spoke to them. So it follows that when you get to this quote that I read earlier, he's saying John was seen not a very long time ago, almost at the end of Domitian's reign. The other point to mention is that in that quote I just read, he talks about the ancient copies. Well, they're not very ancient if they were only written 90 years ago. Thirdly, the third issue is, let's assume that Irenaeus is saying that the revelation was seen towards the end of Domitian's reign. So the revelation was seen in 96 AD. I don't think he is saying that. I think he's saying that John was seen towards the end of Domitian's reign. But let's for a minute say that he isn't. Well, if he is saying that, he does make mistakes. He's not infallible. So, for instance, Irenaeus says that Jesus' ministry lasted for 15 years. He also says that Jesus was 50 when he died. Now, I don't know a single biblical scholar who would affirm that. It's a mistake that Irenaeus has made, and he's allowed to make mistakes. And other early church fathers who then quote Irenaeus, they don't necessarily agree that John was exiled under Domitian. A lot of them seem to think it was under Nero, even when they're quoting him, which would imply that he is saying that it was John who was seen. So that's Irenaeus. That's the main evidence for the late date, which I don't actually think is that useful for showing the late date. The next piece of tradition, of external evidence to look at, is from a man called Clement of Alexandria, who wrote in 200 AD. Now, if you're part of the Vine Church, then you've actually heard me read one of Clement of Alexandria's stories on Sunday. So the story I told of the apostle and the young thug comes from Clement of Alexandria, and it's very helpful for identifying the date of Revelation. So he says this: "Listen to a tale, which is not a mere tale, but a narrative concerning John the Apostle, which has been handed down and treasured up in memory. For when, after the tyrant's death, he returned from the Isle of Patmos to Ephesus," and then he goes on to say when he returned, he went around helping the churches. But notice what he said there. After the tyrant's death, he returned from the Isle of Patmos. So he returns after the tyrant has died, which is very likely a description of Nero, the tyrant, the first persecutor of the Christians. And he goes on from this to tell a story of John having returned, chasing down a young man who has abandoned the church for a life of crime. And he chases him down on horseback and then on foot. Now, if the late date is correct, then John is in his 70s when this story happens. And if he's in his 70s, this is an incredible story. Someone in their 70s in the first century chasing someone down on horseback and then running after them. If the late date is accurate, then John is in his mid-90s at this point. Now, someone in their mid-90s doing this is verging on the ridiculous. A mid-90s man in our time chasing someone down on horseback and then on foot is crazy. In the first century, this is even crazier, perhaps even unheard of. So it's far more sensible to see that Clement is talking about John returning after Nero has died. As well as this, in a different work, Clement of Alexandria writes that all scripture was written by the time that Nero died, so before Paul was executed. Now, Paul was executed in between 67 or 68 AD. So Clement of Alexandria has basically, in both of his works, is showing that he thinks that someone very early in the church thinks that all scripture was written by the time Nero had died. So John goes to Patmos, writes the Revelation under Nero's reign, which Nero reigned until 68 AD. The third piece of tradition, or of external evidence, is something called the Miura Torian Canon. And this is something that was written in between 127 and 170 AD. It was discovered in the 1740s. It's the oldest Latin church document that we have. And in the Muratorian Canon, it says this: "The blessed Apostle Paul, following the rule of his predecessor, John, writes to no more than 7 churches by name." So this ancient writer clearly teaches that John preceded Paul in writing letters to 7 churches. Now, as I say, it's universally agreed among historians that Paul must have died before 70 AD. He must have died before 68 AD. So even if I am wrong, going back to the Irenaeus quote, even if I am wrong and Irenaeus is saying that the revelation was seen in 96 AD, well, this is from earlier than Irenaeus, which shows that at this point in the early church, you already had two different views. One group saying that it was written before the temple was destroyed, the other group saying that it was written afterwards. So for the late day advocates who really make a big deal of Irenaeus and say that the rest of the early church used this, which is not entirely accurate because other people in the church simply quoted Irenaeus. They weren't doing the research themselves. But this shows that there were two views in the church very early on already. As I say, I don't think that Irenaeus is saying that, so I think the church is unified on this. I think the church, up until this point, believes that John saw the revelation before Nero died. The last piece of traditional evidence I want to bring is the Syriac Manuscripts. So these are the New Testament manuscripts that the Syriac churches had, and this is from the 5th or the 6th century. So there's a bit later on in church history now. But we have these manuscripts from the Syriac churches of the Book of Revelation. Now, the title that they gave for the Book of Revelation is this: the revelation which was made to John the Evangelist by God in the island of Patmos, into which he was banished by Nero the Caesar. So that kind of speaks for itself. The very title that they gave it implies that he was given, well, not, it doesn't imply, it explicitly says he was sent to Patmos by Nero. So we've just seen a few bits of church history to show that there was a wide belief that John wrote the Revelation under Nero's reign, so before 68 AD. But tradition isn't infallible, the Bible is. So let's take a look at what the Bible itself says. The self-witness. Now, a lot of the things I'm about to say, I will clarify as we go through the study. So if there's something I say that makes you go, huh? I can guarantee we will get back to it, so don't worry. But the first point is this. Chapter 11 of Revelation, verses 1 and 2, there is the temple. So we're going to talk about this more later, but the temple absolutely dominated Jewish thinking, especially as it pertains to worshipping God. And we see this not only in the Bible itself, and we'll look at this a bit more in part 2, but in the works of Jews living around the same time. So, for instance, I have this book here. It's called The Jewish War by Josephus. Now, Josephus was a first century Jew who wrote about the temple being destroyed. There are sections in this narrative where he just pauses to kind of cry out in anguish over the temple being destroyed. You get a real sense of how a Jew deals with the temple being destroyed. Now, bear in mind, if you were writing a book about the God of Israel just after the temple was destroyed, you can almost guarantee it would be mentioned. So, and in fact, most of the church documents that were written afterwards do mention the temple being destroyed. It was a really big deal. As I say, it's the same thing as the person in New York. If someone was writing a book about life in New York, you can almost guarantee that they would mention 9/11. It's a defining part of the history, even more so when you think of Jews writing about Jerusalem or salvation. So, what do we see in chapter 11? Where do we see the temple? Well, we see that it's still standing. John is he's given a vision and he's told to go and measure it because it will be destroyed. So, to be destroyed, it has to still be standing. The assumption is the temple is still there, yet to be destroyed. And it is told it will be handed over to the Gentiles for 42 months. Now, some late-day advocates will say that this section was written before the fall of Jerusalem, and the rest of it was just written afterwards. John added it in, but I don't really buy that. We're not going to get into why, but we'll get into chapter 11 further on. But as I say, the temple is still standing. Now, there was a book written in the 1970s, I believe, called Redating the New Testament by a man called John A.T. Robinson. Now, this made huge waves because A.T. Robinson was a liberal, and liberals are known for basically putting the writing of the New Testament off later and later. It was just later Christian works. And so some of them say that, books of the Bible weren't written until like 300 AD. But John A.T. Robinson came back and said, what would the worldview of a Jew be? What would they write about? And he started thinking about the centrality of the temple and Jewish worship and came to the conclusion all of the books of the New Testament must have been written before the temple was destroyed, because none of them talk about it having been destroyed. They all either anticipate its destruction or acknowledge its current existence. So that's a really big point, the temple. And as I say, we're going to talk about the temple in part 2. The second piece of internal evidence that's kind of major is from chapter 17. So in chapter 17, we see the Roman Empire described as a seven-headed beast. And we know it's the Roman Empire for a variety of reasons. We're not going to talk about that now because I've got a whole part lined up just to talk about the beast. But anyway, this beast has 7 heads, which John is told represents 7 kings. He's told 5 have fallen, 1 is, and the other has not yet come, but when he does, he will remain for a little while. So when Nero was emperor, there were 5 emperors who had gone before him. So Julius Caesar, Augustus, Tiberius, Caligula, and Claudius. Then Nero came, and after Nero killed himself with his own sword in AD 68, he was preceded by the Emperor Galba, who was emperor for 7 months. So the 5 have fallen, 1 is Nero, and 1 is yet to come, which is Galba, and he must remain for a little while, 7 months. So Revelation was written during the reign of the 6th king, Nero, and so it must have been written somewhere between AD 64 and AD 68. So they're 2 really major points of where the book is referring to when it's written. A more minor point is the presence of Jewish groups in the churches. So after the fall of Jerusalem, when the temple was destroyed, Christianity and Judaism were seen as very distinct religious groups. Beforehand, people kind of thought of Christians as a Jewish sect, just like the Sadducees or the Pharisees. But after the temple was destroyed, you had one group who was mourning their temple, mourning their holy city, and the other who just weren't really that fussed because they had the true temple, Jesus. And so this meant that the Judaizers, so if you've read Galatians, you'll know who the Judaizers are. They were the ones who were bothering the Gentile Christians. They were telling them to be saved, you need to be circumcised, you need to become a Jew. Now, the Judaizers didn't exist after Jerusalem's fall because Christianity and Judaism became very distinct groups. But in the letters to 7 churches in Revelation, we see that the Judaizers are still bothering the Christians. So in chapter 2, verse 9, it says, "I know your tribulation and your poverty, but you are rich, and the slander of those who say they are Jews and are not, but are a synagogue of Satan." Again, in chapter 3, verse 9, we read, "Behold, I will make those of the synagogue of Satan, who say that they are Jews and are not, but lie. Behold, I will make them come and bow down before your feet, and they will learn that I have loved you." So the Christians are still being bothered by Jewish groups. This is a pre-70 AD situation. You didn't have this happen after the temple was destroyed. So that's a more minor point, but I hope you can see that from tradition and internal evidence, there is a strong deal to see that Revelation was written prior to the temple's destruction. Now, on the handout, you'll see that I've got a bonus method of finding out the date, and my bonus method is covenantal context or redemptive historical context. And so I believe that all the New Testament was written before the Old Covenant was formally ended. So the Old Covenant came formally to an end when the temple was destroyed. You would not be able to go and sacrifice an animal or talk to a priest after the temple was destroyed. That was when God drew a line in the sand and said, "This is over." From that point, the New Covenant came in full force. It was established by Jesus, but there was like a crossover period. Now, the New Testaments are the documents of the New Covenant. I find it odd that having destroyed the Old Covenant, saying this is categorically over and the New Covenant is categorically here now, the documents that define it are still being written. The New Testament is still being written. That doesn't sit right with me. I think that the New Testament was finished and then God ended the Old Covenant and fully established the New Covenant. I'll give you an example of what I mean. When I still lived in Honiton, I used to meet up with a Jehovah's Witness. And one day he told me the end of the world began in 1914. And I said, "What do you mean?" And he said, "Well, the end of the world began in 1914. And I said, "What? Yeah, but what happened in 1914? And he said, "Oh, the end of the world began." And it was, you kind of see my frustration. I was like, you can't just say the end of the world began. There must have been something that kind of happened. And he just said, "No, it's just when it happened." In a similar but different way, if the Jews were to ask the Christians, well, how do you know the Old Covenant's over? The Christians didn't have to just say, well, it just is, it's just over. They could say, God destroyed his temple, he destroyed Jerusalem. What more do you need than that? He's not going to be rebuilding it. It's over. It was a very much drawing a line in the sand. And so for that reason, I think that all of the New Testament was written pre-70 AD. So that's a very quick overview. Now, as I was supposed to say at the beginning, if you are a Revelation scholar and you happen to be watching this, I'm sorry, we're not going to be going as in-depth as you might like. I know that I haven't done everything that is possibly related to the dating of Revelation. That's not my intention. But I hope you can see from the brief amount of information I've given that there is strong evidence to see that Revelation was written before the temple came down. And that's going to be really important when we come to interpreting it later on. So I hope you've enjoyed that, and I'll see you for part 2 in a couple of days, hopefully. So thanks a lot.